So in this video, I wanted to address some of the questions that have come towards me and also that are reasonable or that might be in the minds of some of the people that know me or are just kind of going through people's minds around this project. The first question, are you grateful for anything that you've learned or kind of encountered in the Human Awareness Institute or with the facilitators? So I'd have to say that each of my one-on-one interactions with Peter Sandhill have been more destructive than constructive. As a psychic, he recommended and persisted in recommending marriage with one of the most inappropriate people that I could think of. And in both the initial work, shortly after taking a few high workshops where I was kind of thrown into a quandary around grappling with the imbalances of power, the kind of prospect of a homosexual relationship, paying a therapist who was sexually interested in me, and particularly the psychedelic abuses because of the high influenceability of the state. That would have been great if none of that had happened. The work that I did with Ann Watts one-on-one was actually beneficial in validating parts of my rather unique personality. And it was also, as the culture moves in the direction of escalating the assumption that if something's wrong in a relationship, it's wrong with the men. And not that there isn't a lot to that, but that the default assumption in all cases is that there's something wrong with the man, that Anne was quite valuable in affirming my value, my intelligence, that what I was perceiving was accurate. And that work was quite constructive. The negativity or the damage done with not just Anne and the other high facilitators, but with a number of practitioners, is that I've demonstrated and spoken about traumatic symptoms, which one can, if one has a little bit of basic training, can hear very easily in fight, flight, freeze type reactions as well as body language. And the fact that I was going to professionals at the time who completely ignored all of that, one, but also affirmed their interest in helping and affirmed that going to them was the right thing, left traumatic blind spots kind of just glaringly in the space in a way that I thought I was doing the right thing by seeing up to 3 different practitioners a week, none of whom actually addressed the underlying issue of trauma. And so I think there's a way that, for example, if you've got HIV and you go to a doctor and they prescribe cold medicine and they pick up on a cold and they prescribe antidepressants or something and they pick up on that and they say you're good to go, that it can be more damaging, more harmful than not getting a professional opinion at all, because the confidence in the professional ends up, when there's an ignorance in the field, misdirecting away from the core issue while appearing to say I'm doing what I ought to be doing, when in fact the key thing is to start taking antiviral medication as quickly as possible and to suspect that something needs to be done. And so in that aspect, it's destructive. The workshops themselves have, I think, done a great job at teaching the language of requests and permissions and boundaries and choice. However, in a similar domain, when the workshops fail to cover addiction, compulsivity, trauma, sexual abuse, and any language around the fact that when one has an abuse contract and an abuse history, one will reenact that abuse contract until it is dealt with, until it comes to light, and until it is disentangled with any misinformation around love. Parents in a parentally illiterate culture are masters at masking abuses, cruelty, trauma, etc., under this general veil of a parent's love. And this actually confuses and cross-wires the meaning of love. So not having even a definition of what love is set me up to both abuse other people, meaning I followed the protocol that said, never do this without permission. So, may I do this? And people would say, sure. But their bodies would give a different story. And I didn't know how to make sense of this, because one of the clauses in almost all abuse contracts is this abuse contract isn't abuse, and it was never signed, and it doesn't exist. And when this is signed, often pre-verbally or in young childhood, it comes with a death sentence, meaning abuse contracts are always agreed to under duress, with the implication that one could die if one fails to accommodate the abuser, the giant, the parent. And so I would see not only lies, no, nothing's going on, but terror in some of my lovers' eyes. And this, just threw me for a loop repeatedly within the 30 lovers within the high community, and to some extent subsequently in other lovers in life. And the idea that people are at choice around traumatic events that have been cross-wired, where abuse has been mixed with love, is a lie. People are not at choice until they've received adequate support to A, face the trauma, B, know what is and isn't abuse, 3, break the contract to where they can tell the truth rather than the projected abuser. When you're in an abuse contract, you have a projection of your abuser onto whoever you're close with, the lover. And the general response is not to tell the truth, but to say what you believe the abuser wants to hear. And in a regressed state, there is a feeling of death if the relationship ends. And so I would have women who would say yes and would clearly be in some kind of what I would now call trauma, and then I would just say a crazy, schizophrenia of some kind, where they weren't into what they said yes to. And I would try and dig into this, and this would terrify them, because it's in an abuse contract, you cannot acknowledge that the contract exists or become sane. That's part of the abuse contract, to cover that terrain up. And so I was both harmed in my own abuse contracts and also harmed other people, just not knowing how to navigate this terrain, and amplifying sexuality in the midst is the exact wrong thing to do. Slowing down and pulling apart and getting to know the person on the inside with an adequate paradigm is critical. And so in many ways, I might well be a healthier person without the history of, dozens upon dozens of traumatic incidents that occurred in the domain of this blind spot. And then certainly to have my therapists collude in a cover-up that masked one of the most significant parts of my life with the message that our secret is more important than your sanity, your life, your dignity, and your inclusion, is an incredibly damaging message. And so it's hard to say overall, whether I would be much better off never having encountered high. And so, to the next question, what is your purpose, underlying all of this events? I would say that my primary goal is to see that everyone involved who wants to has the opportunity to learn what I've subsequently learned, and that the Human Awareness Institute either adopts and integrates these critical databases for health, well-being, sanity, and people actually winning, let alone having a loving relationship, is so important that it would be better if a school that is, again, I see more danger in people having an undue and uneducated confidence in a paradigm in a school that sets them up to failure than recognizing that they don't know what they were doing. Meaning, I went to high because I knew that I didn't know what I was doing. And I wanted to learn. And I thought I knew what I was doing after working with 4 facilitators and taking 100, spending time at 100 high events. I thought I knew what I was doing. And I think that false confidence is more dangerous than knowing that one doesn't know what one is doing, which creates more humility, more caution, etc. And so, so that's a key purpose. And so, Dane, you've created a lot of content, and you have a lot of ideas. Why not just go and do this on your own, and teach or share whatever you have to teach, etc., rather than kind of pushing towards the Human Awareness Institute to adopt, whether it's correct or not, your view of things. And there's a couple of thoughts or kind of awarenesses around that. First of all, I don't think I'm competent to teach. I don't think I'm competent, certainly, to be professional. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But it's not. I do not feel that just because I'm very aware of massive gaps in information and abuses of power and stuff, that therefore, I should start a school or something and replace high, particularly on my own. I think that I have some very important pieces that are useful for anyone in this field, and I will be making this available. My preference is to share this information to professionals so that they can benefit and learn from and adopt, because then they have their professional training, it's already their career, and they can incorporate this information and know when and how and work that out, because that's really their field. Another very obvious question: why so much information? Thousands of hours of video and stuff, touching on various aspects of this. Why so much information? Or so many videos, And there's a couple of pieces around this. The wound and how it hit me, one of the big ones was in the domain of sanity. Ann Watts, in one of her last emails, said, "I've never loved anyone as much as I've loved you other than my family." And I was feeling terrible at that point in terms of Ann's impact on me. And a lot of that was the sanity. Like, have you really loved people so poorly that, someone in more pain than they've ever been in as a direct consequence of your impact is connected to so much love, which brought up this awareness like, gee, the Human Awareness Institute has never defined love. They haven't defined responsibility. They haven't defined trauma. They haven't defined a protocol for responding to addiction. The best thing the High Office has to say if you're being intimidated by someone violating community trust is to stay out of it. I don't know what I'm doing. I still don't know what I'm doing. I'm in the same place as I was when I arrived at High. I went from thinking I knew what I was doing, realizing that obviously I didn't if I chose these people as my therapists and thought this was it. And so sanity seemed like the number one thing. And the wound to heal was to break apart all of these very complex things in as many details as possible so that I could, I guess, facilitate my own emotional and relational education. And then the question is, how do you do that in a cult or a culture that is, in pathological denial of the issues, when all anyone wants to say is, how are you doing? I'm fine, you're fine, we're fine, etc. And then that's all the time we've got. We've got to go tweet and do this and binge watch Netflix, etc. So how do you sort things together, which ideally happens in informed, intelligent conversations with people who know more than you, when no one makes time to talk? And this is quite an interesting narrative. I wrote to Peter Levine. I wrote to Bessel van der Kolk's group. I wrote to Elaine Aron. I wrote to 100 of Elaine Aron's therapists that she recommended to engage in dialogue. And what's fascinating is the wall around discussing these things in detail in documentary form or other that all these people who presumably, if they're writing books, know more, have up. Never heard back from Peter Levine. Elaine Aron said she didn't have time. Never heard back from Elaine Aron's therapist. The Bessel van der Kolk's group, hesitantly engaged, but demonstrated in the communication that I didn't talk with Bessel directly, I didn't think that they adequately grasped the situation. One guy said, contact me in 2 weeks. I'm fighting a story in the newspaper about trauma right now. And I told him about some of the abuses and stuff, and I thought, this is fascinating. A newspaper story is trumping a documentary. It's also trumping dealing with someone in trauma. This is a little bit sociopathic, and so I'm filtering out and more cautious now with professionals to try and sense, do you actually have a competent protocol and resources to respond to this? And I would say that the answer is no. I wrote to, I think, Tian Dayton or whatever it was. Yeah, I think it was Tian Dayton in her emotional sobriety book, and I wrote to Brené Brown. No reply. And so I realized that these people want to put out books, but they don't actually want to engage the issue. Or they're more comfortable with their colleagues, which is a very common, somewhat chauvinistic approach, where the expert is viewed based on credentials rather than someone actually experiencing trauma. Many scientists and researchers, they do not want to engage with feelings of someone actually and have to demonstrate their lack of empathy or competence. And they want to discuss research papers and stuff with other colleagues who hopefully are not in a traumatic state. So I realized that all this dialogue that I needed to have was kind of going to have to be with me and the books and what I was learning and integrating that on my own. But I was too exhausted to type. And so I decided I would just talk into the camera a lot and would kind of integrate and learn as I went. And I found this to be very helpful because unlike therapists, cameras don't interrupt you. They don't have agendas. They don't get defensive. And so the camera has become a key therapist in a certain way for integrating sanity. I've always learned by talking, meaning I've had hundreds and hundreds of interactions with people in life that have people have asked me questions, and I've given them advice or answers in one form, and generally they ignore them. But I pay attention and make changes, and my life improves, meaning I have an 85% track record, give or take, where if I think something's a good idea and I do it, my life improves, 80, 90% of the time. And that's a good track record. And so I realized if I could talk things through and apply them, what I was saying in my own life, that might be better than that. So that's, a lot of it. Now, I have an abuse contract that says that I will be killed for telling the truth, that I will be beaten and traumatized for going up against an authority figure. Now, what this meant in very practical, visceral terms is that my body prepared to die every time I confronted authority, be it the high facilitators, be it videos about this. And I started to actually understand that my reaction, my expectation viscerally of death and shock, was actually one of the biggest threats to my life. I also understood that this is why so many victims of abuse do not come forward, is they experience the shaking and the fear of death as they come, they have vital information for the safety of the public, but they experience a visceral terror around coming forward. And I've been dealing with this from day one. It's one of the reasons that trauma went into PTSD. The moment the facilitators behaved at a level of insanity that helped me understand that they were a threat to aspects of public safety, and they either didn't know it or they knew it and they didn't want to engage and respond. And they certainly didn't want to know it. This is a very important part of the narrative. It began, I understood that I had to confront authority, but I expected to die and felt the physical, that's part of the transition from trauma into PTSD around this issue, was the expectation of death because the confrontation became necessary due to the level of criminal willful negligence. This is not a high issue. We won't apologize. Because I understood implicitly something that High teaches, which is that this wasn't personal. In other words, I had to look at the fact that if a 20-year-old had been molested by a facilitator, that they were going to get this spiel about it not being a high issue, blah, 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 and basically blamed, shamed, controlled. And I thought this could lead to death. This could lead to suicide. This could lead to a variety of things. Very probable. Just basic psychological awareness when your authorities, particularly in the name of love and your teachers and all that, are actually abusing you, that there's a part of you that wants to believe and that wants to take on the childhood wound again that says it's all my fault. And this, frankly, was and remains to a certain extent the single biggest vulnerability around the whole issue. The fact that confrontation with authority was necessary, and the fact that I expected to die, which re-traumatized every time I moved into direct confrontation. And so I slowed down the process a lot. And so one of the things I was doing was desensitization around that fear. Meaning the first time I said things, I left my body because I was that clear I would die. The second time I left things, I felt angry that I was fearing death because professionals had abused me and I was telling the truth because I knew it was wrong, but I still felt I was going to die. And there's a grief around this. There's a helplessness. There's a disintegration around that narrative because I'm doing the right thing as far as I can see in all the data, but I'm fearing for my life. And I'm angry about that. But now the anger brings about more confrontation, which escalates the fear of death. And so there's this catch-22. And Bessel van der Kolk talks about one aspect of PTSD, which is, I think it's cognitive therapy, where you just re-expose the trauma and desensitize. So I understood that every single time I talked about this issue, I was desensitizing. One, I was reliving the trauma and refacing the fear of death, but I was also desensitizing. Now, the other thing that happens because of the fear of death, combined with trauma, combined with repressed grief, combined with age regression, and combined with this not being my field, I was much more incoherent early on. It was literally kind of my body would feel as I'd begin a video that I was running over, a killing field with snipers at me, expecting to be hit at any point. And that doesn't lead to coherence and clear connection with an audience. And I understood this, which also alerted me that this is atrocious. Because I've had actually people in our culture tell me that because I looked down, because I felt scared, because I was hesitant as I told 100% true things, that they didn't believe me. They said I was lying. They said, look, your eyes look down, that's a tell, you're lying. And I thought, this is vicious. Do you mean to say sexual abuse survivors that are terrified of breaking their abuse contracts and who go into regression because they're breaking the abuse contract and they're afraid of dying are going to be judged as lying because their body symptoms do not match up with the bullshit? It turns out Malcolm Gladwell did a great thing in his recent book, Talking with Strangers, where he points out how there was a highly traumatized woman who dissociated around the murder of one of her roommates. And the police were so convinced of this bullshit around eye contact and all this that they jailed her on no evidence for like 4 years because she demonstrated the traumatic symptoms of dissociation, which everyone else around her, including her flatmates, said that's not how a sincere flatmate would respond if, she arrived home and discovered her flatmate was dead. She must be the guilty one. And that was it. Conviction based on ignorance and based on traumatic body language. And we are in a traumatically illiterate cult, meaning trauma is everywhere, and you can go from cradle to grave with therapy without learning a single science-based set of facts around trauma and its many consequences. And so I understood that this was a vulnerability. And so part of, whether it's in trial or anything else, I understood that for ignorant people in a traumatically illiterate cult to believe me, that I would have to face my fear of death because we as a culture lack the traumatic awareness to differentiate between truth and lies in a traumatic setting. This is incredibly barbaric, and it is a reality that I want to bring to light. But this is another aspect of kind of going through things. And then finally, when you're running for your life through a topic, because it's the body sensations, nuance gets lost. And so I would get to the end of most videos and say, wow, not only was that like a death run, but I forgot to mention this and I forgot to mention that. And we're also an image-based cult. And so we, to a certain extent at a sociopathic level in our culture, we don't actually even care about the facts. We like someone based on their style of presenting. And this is pretty disgusting, frankly, because as Gladwell points out, people have a variety of different styles. And we tend to punish minorities who have a different way of processing. And for example, I haven't been able to process grief since I was 5 years old, or I think it was 6, 7 years old, and my third grade teacher died, and I felt absolutely nothing because there wasn't a single grown-up around me that modeled grief, and the primary rule in my family was thou shalt not feel intense feelings. Now, as this kind of burst open through the psychedelic meltdown, I didn't have the luxury of not feeling anymore. I just didn't know how to do it and integrate it and hold it and love myself and all that. And there's all this message screaming, you're going to die, you're going to die, you're going to die, because you're breaking the law, you're having deep feelings. The family law of survival, if you're going to belong and be loved in this family, you shall not have deep feelings. And everyone in my family agrees to this law. I have 4 younger siblings. None of them have broken the law. It's causing them immense damage. And I've done the most to kind of stretch into that domain. And so there's an issue of sanity. There's an issue of desensitization. There's an awareness of, the contract. And also, no one sits down and explains that you at 5-year-old agreed that to get dad's love, you would never see the truth in this area. And if you violated that, you knew you would be out in your ear and hated and never be loved again, which to an abused, lonely, and unloved child is absolutely terrifying, let alone, it's also life-threatening. It's terrifying. And so, and it's important to understand that the facilitators and the Human Awareness Institute were my community. They were my primary source of love and belonging, which is the same for every, abused child. Their parents, their family is their primary source of love and belonging, however abusive. The other kind of thing to be aware of is that the smaller one feels in a retriggering childhood dynamic of age regression, the bigger the issue in the world and the abusers feel, by contrast, because it's all relative. So if suddenly I'm feeling 2 years old, because this is triggering 2-year-old abuse memories, Peter alone is now a giant. Now, that's not an adult perspective. And in a shame-based cult that is traumatically illiterate, you would shame someone like myself, grow up, because you don't know what you're talking about. And that shame has come my way. It's incredibly brutal to all concerned. It's ineffective, but it is a reality. So the regression made everything look very big. And so the response to something so big had to be equally big. And here we have a little bit of an interesting area where the facilitator's ignorance about this dynamic, because they're traumatically illiterate, and in Jason Weston's words, trauma is not a high focus. Well, it should be its core focus if it wants healthy relationship in an abuse cult. But that being said, everything they did to make me feel smaller made the response have to be 10 times bigger in order to feel like it was an adequate response, because the perspective inside is of a terrified child trying to keep the big giants, the enemy, at bay. And that creates a very reactive state, which I also understood in many abuse cycles in a traumatically illiterate cult actually leads to the abuse, continuing. So I wanted to practice, and I would say that I've gotten more centered and more grounded, etc. I'm only about 40% out of my body at this moment. Well, that's a huge relief. Plus, of course, understanding why, etc., makes me more comfortable with being that uncomfortable. This is incredibly uncomfortable, which, of course, in a projection-based rather than an education-based cult is not noticed. I've learned throughout my life that no one reads me accurately, which is incredibly alarming because nobody asks. So first of all, no one reads me accurately. I've done tests. I've done it with lovers who have known me for years. I've said, why do you think I'm doing this that I'm doing and saying this at this time? They have a theory, right? And they proceed to explain why I'm doing this. I say, no, you don't have a clue. Your premise, your paradigm is wrong. You're 3 levels off. You don't understand this bit, so therefore you don't understand this bit, and what I'm doing here is a response to this bit, which is based on this bit that you don't even know exists. So please do not project your bullshit, your narrative, onto me. Ask me, and I will explain. And if you're good at tracking, which it takes good tracking skills to go to the level of paradigm and work back from there. It's a mathematical equation, but it's a mathematical equation that starts with the paradigm. And paradigms in our cult are invisible. Nobody bothers to understand the frame from which the perspective is viewed. They're understanding the content of the frame from their frame. And this is the source of most misunderstanding. And so, and nobody wants to make the time to go that deep in misunderstanding and sorting this out, which is a travesty because it guarantees that I am invisible with every single person in my life who does not show willingness to listen and ask about the frame and the context, the paradigm, and how I've built up my model, which is relatively conscious because when you don't have an emotional attachment with either parent, the brain has to do digitally what would be intuitively, what would happen intuitively. You would attune intuitively and unconsciously and instinctively in a healthy family dynamic. I had to build it up conscious step by conscious step to get to the point where I could navigate. Almost no one has done that. They've either just gone numb and frozen because they couldn't bond, and so they've become dissociative to a degree that is, incoherent. One of 2 forks happens at that junction of severe trauma and emotional dissociation. Either you become super conscious of code writing to the degree that, for example, if your Windows computer or your Apple's computer and your app or your phone stopped working, one of 2 things would happen. You'd either learn code and be able to go into the source code and type in 20 zeros and ones here, this, that, the other, this, command this, and you'd get it to work that way, and you'd become a brilliant programmer. To bypass the fact that the app icons are not interfacing with the hardware behind. So you'd become a brilliant coder, or you'd just become dysfunctional because you'd press the button, nothing would happen. And so I took the former path, which means a lot of cognitive effort to do what other people can do with just tapping a nice little icon. It's wonderful, And that little icon has a nice connection with the back program, which runs, 300,000 lines of code and program loads up nicely. I had to do a lot of that from scratch. And it's one of the reasons why my code is unique, because there's a lot of dysfunctional code in the cult. Where the icons work, they're very inefficient. And when you're in the back end, you see it. I mean, good programmers hate Windows, particularly the old, Windows 95 and stuff. They'd say, this is bullshit. How do you take 10 million lines of code and just get this out? You're bogging up the computer. This is bullshit code. Apple had a better code. Android has a better code. And so when you're in the back end, you don't have to write your code as crappily as the instinctual code. Now, no person in their sane mind would go through this arduous task of building a paradigm, building a value hierarchy, building a strategy, building goals, building feedback loops, and testing hypotheses for just about everything they do. It's a lot of work. If you can just tap a button and wait 5 seconds and it clunkily loads or whatever, fine, do it. I didn't have that option because the code was too dangerous in my family and the icons didn't line up. And so, I'm in a very uncomfortable position of understanding how crappy a lot of the back code is, understanding that no one knows my code and they're not going to ask because they're just going to assume that the same button presses when they press that, and that's going to unload, and that's for the same reason everyone else does. And they probably haven't even analyzed it. They don't know their own code. They don't know why this and that. And this made me very good with animals, for example, because animals are sane more than human beings, etc. And so, I had a cat, for example, that swam when I'd go swimming in the lake. My cat was bonded to me because when you connect with code, you can, animals are much easier to read and connect with. So there was a bond there that was tighter than normal. I had a wild bird that I rescued and brought back to life, who'd fly out in the wild and then come back to my shoulder. And this is a wild animal with no cage or anything like that. But it takes a specific kind of attunement. It also gives me a strength with diverse personalities. I can connect with them at connecting points that the cult doesn't have available and position my code to see into their world. So I can work with special children or special individuals, unique people, more effectively than average. Let's say that. But I'm very paranoid about our cult's habit of projecting its stuff on me and being completely wrong, 3 levels wrong. It's not just they're wrong about, they're not just wrong about why I did something, they're wrong about the value that was behind why I did that, and they're wrong about the experience and kind of analysis behind which I had that value. They're wrong 3 levels deep. So it's worse to have them think that they know me than to have them think that I'm an alien. Because if they thought I was an alien, and this is one of the reasons I started saying I had Asperger's, it's, if you understand the DSM manual and all the bullshit that they've done to come up with literally 5,000 diagnoses for mental emotional disorder, which basically means that everyone in the country has some levels of emotional mental disease. If you understand that bullshit, then, you can label yourself any particular way. It doesn't matter particularly what the label is. And you also understand that these things are not fixed points, they're gradients, and you understand that there's generally a survival-based strategy behind the expression of the disease that's intelligent under the circumstances of the biological memory and things like that. So you understand all that. And so it's not real to me to say I do have Asperger's or I don't. I can just look at the label and say, yes, I demonstrate a number of Asperger's-like tendencies, for better and for worse, meaning, my choice points at different points for responding to very difficult situations. I chose points, for example, when I couldn't bond with human beings, I learned that my stability, every human being has a mix of certainty and uncertainty that is a need. You need a certain amount of certainty and you need a certain amount of uncertainty. And first you need certainty, and when you're confident in that, then you start exploring, which is why in early childhood development, they have this whole, good therapists who actually do their work and stuff. They study children. And for example, if the mother is very secure and the little girl can run back and hold her skirts, she'll go further and further away from the mother if the mother is stable and there to return home, because the mother is providing the certainty, and then the child can develop and explore the world and become confident in a stronger degree. Whereas if the mother is volatile, unpredictable, as in every addict, the child will cling desperately to the parent. Well, I had unpredictable parents who were volatile, and so that panic of every time leaving this, the certainty. So when you couldn't bond with either parent, I bonded to things, which is an Asperger's-like tendency. Why things? Because they didn't lie, because they were certain. This chair has never let me down. This camera has never let me down. You will let me down 10,000 times next week in a variety of ways you don't even grasp, because you're not looking at the data points the way I am. But this chair, still here. Things provided my certainty, so I became very fixated with things. This is a social limitation, because no one else would respect my things and the thing boundaries, which were the kind of parallel to relational boundaries and, bonds, etc. It also meant I didn't learn emotional regulation, because all this was done with code, not generating instinctively through feelings. I had to track things that most people don't have to track. Now, some people have called me a genius. Ann Watts has called me a genius at self-awareness. Genius is not always a good thing. Many of our most competent, postgraduate, highly educated people are less happy, for example, than the average person. So it's obviously not good to be intelligent by university standards if being intelligent makes you less happy. That's not intelligent. Intelligence is the efficiency with which you transform energy into human well-being. So to spend lots of money and lots of studious time to get postgraduate degrees that make you less happy is the opposite of intelligence. But of course, a university will not discuss the definition of intelligence, and so you're just referencing, it's a self-referential loop. They've decided that if you get this degree, you're intelligent, and if you don't, they're not, and having decided that, it's just left at that. So if you get the degree, you're intelligent. If you're not, you're not. This is absurd. It's absolutely absurd, but most university professors are not at the level to analyze the paradigm of intelligence, and they're uneasy because their tenure depends on their definition of intelligence. So it's triggering survival issues, so they're not interested in coming into a debate. And then most of the students are unable to analyze the underlying issues of the professor. All they can analyze is that their cult will give them more money and safety and security if they do what the teacher says, and they won't otherwise. And that's enough. And they don't want anyone confusing that thing, because they might get bad grades, and their dependency is on the system, not on the underlying design by which the code, which the system was supposedly designed to get. Everyone knows at some level that we want to feel good and we don't want to feel bad, and that if we're going to feel worse by going to university long term, that we wouldn't do it. We're going because we believe we're going to feel better in some way, which is the lie and the travesty of high student debt at the present time with universities, and why I'm so delighted I designed my own homeschooling program from the ground up with the primary question: what skills does a species need over the next 100 years that I could develop and become expert in that are uncommon because that is the way I can contribute the most value to my species, which should be the metric by which people are compensated. And I decided to work for myself because most employers do not have the intelligence to value the skills that provide the most value. They're looking through a different lens. And so it's unsatisfying to be rewarded for behaving more stupidly relative to the underlying issues of well-being. Now, most people get furious by this point in the conversation, so I rarely have this conversation. They get furious because I'm saying that they don't know, I'm saying you don't know, and I'm saying you don't know, you don't know, and I'm saying you don't know, you don't know, you don't know, and you're 3 levels off in misperceiving things, and that all these institutional things that are holding up the cult are defunct, and that some guy who didn't finish high school officially, I'm still learning every day. In fact, I studied Malcolm Gladwell for 3 hours today because he's a good analyzer of patterns, and I would rather listen to Malcolm talk about certain things if I want to adjust my paradigm in some area than I would a university professor any day of the week, because that's something he's good at. And I have the ability to analyze how good he is at that and benefit from, years of research and still disagree with him and see pros and cons and this and that and the other. So that's useful. But, Nassim Taleb is one of the people that does a lot of this deep thinking. He's very unpopular among academics because he's operating at a level of code analysis that is sub-academics. So he's not following their rules, which makes him very competent as an investor, which is why he's made lots of money, because he's applied that talent to the stock market. I could be good in that terrain, but the biggest pain of my life has been the understanding of how destructive it is to value money more than human beings. And we're in that cult. And so I've put my talent mostly in the domain of relationship dynamics. And if you want to understand a tiny bit of that, like 20, 30% of, some of the things that I calculate intuitively and kind of mathematically in my engagements, read my book, Co-Creating Conscious Chemistry. I focused in that book on things that I've not read in any of the relationship books that I've read. John Gottman does, some of this type of work, and it's a rare thing in a chauvinistic cult to actually have a scientist study relationships in a data-based, experience-based way rather than impose their models based on, a variety of current dogmas, in our culture. So understanding how big my blind spot was in this area, I had to start building code in massive areas that had been missing since childhood, that I had been overlooking to protect my parents from feeling incompetent and to protect my therapists from feeling incompetent, because therapists are among the most defensive people you can get if you start suggesting that they don't know what the fuck they're doing, which many of them don't. And they don't know that they don't know what the fuck they're doing, and they are not pleased to hear about it. Because it would require thinking and doing something else other than just taking passive notes, with their clients. And as I say, I don't talk about this much because everyone who doesn't know me thinks I'm an arrogant jerk and is determined to get me after hearing something like this. It's no fun. And it takes an average, when I've had these kind of interactions in proximity with someone, it takes an average of 6 months before someone grasps that I actually know what the fuck I'm talking about. And for them to switch from kind of telling me to shut up to actually wanting to learn from me. And that is a very rare thing. I get on very well with highly self-confident, highly intuitive, highly integrated, incredibly smart, empathic individuals, whether they're psychotherapists or this, that, the other. They grasp that they can learn something from me. This is also very misleading, because the fact that someone can learn something from this technology does not mean I am mature emotionally. It's the opposite. I've had to learn this technology to compensate from devastating levels of emotional abuse and immaturity, which reside in my body and which can be triggered with conflict into regression, where I feel like a terrified 2-year-old. And it doesn't matter that I know how much the person who's terrifying me doesn't know, and I know what I know, and I know the statistics of that. That doesn't matter. I'm dealing with that with a 2-year-old expecting to die, and it's devastating. And so I shut up most of the time. And one of the things I like about kind of notifying people of my pathology, because that's how we view divergence in this culture, is we pathologize it all. Anything diverse is pathological in our culture. And so Asperger's is immediately viewed as a little bit of a pity type thing. Well, I'd much rather be treated kindly as a dumb idiot than I would thought as somewhat you know it all, blah, blah, blah. And so it works. But it only works up to a point. It doesn't work in a domain like this, where the incompetence of professionals is damaging and destroying people's lives, and they don't want to know about it. It doesn't work in this terrain. So this is a very big life thing. I think this is the only time I have not withdrawn from a conflict, because it's easier to just withdraw and recreate a scenario somewhere else where I'm not in conflict than it is to be in battle with a larger energy that has survival fears in play. That is a terrifying domain for me. Ethics are the only thing that give me the stamina to go through this amount of terror to face these issues. And it is still terrifying. And it endangers my life, because when I dissociate and I'm afraid of, my odds of getting into a traffic accident go up about 1,000%. I have to get off the road and this is a disability. And we do not, as a culture, have the distinctions and intelligence to analyze things like huge disability here, huge intelligence level here, incompatible superiority here, but it doesn't work. I mean, what's the good of having an Apple if it doesn't log in if it can't connect with a PC? It doesn't matter that there are less hacks in the Apple system than in a PC system, because hackers target PCs because they have 78% of the market. It doesn't matter that it's a superior system. You can't plug it in and have it run a PC program. So that is a level of thoughtfulness that is not in the consciousness of 98, 99% of the people that I'm going to be dealing with this. And it's incredibly debilitating. So I take the hit again and again and again, either appearing to be dumb and just letting that be the case, or going with weird. I'm a weird person with Asperger's. Take pity on me. Don't hurt me. Thankfully, my 2-year-old is going to feel it. Don't hurt me. I will not threaten your paradigm. I will just go and do my own thing very effectively. When I had some conflict with a networking group, I left. Wrote a book. Made me $100,000 a year in the 2009 recession, because that was a code hack with a built-up response to that was way easier than convincing a group of people who didn't know me that I had some good ideas. Why? If you don't have this particular type of intelligence, which is unusual, pattern analyzing intelligence, you cannot tell who has it and who doesn't, or understand its value. So a tremendous amount of my potential, to great grief, is completely ignored and unrecognized in all domains in my life. And the areas that it works for me are areas where I know it myself and apply it and achieve a lot in those domains. So I'll carry on with why so many videos. Well, so lots of code building, basically, and analyzing. I'm very critical of myself. So I'm right 85% of the time. Well, obviously, you'd make millions in Vegas if you could have those odds at the table. It doesn't mean that I'm not wrong, a noticeable percentage of the time. And I also understand the limits of human consciousness, which means I'm absolutely wrong 100% of the time, just a little bit more right than the status quo 85% of the time. But I'm still wrong. I'm still wrong. And so the question becomes, how far into the future to go to make that assessment? 1,000 years in the future, I'd say every single thing I've said, in this whole thing is bullshit, because it's not complex enough. It's just at the point where I've had the chance to develop that with zero outside support. We're afraid of the unknown, and so I bring up fear. The only thing that just about everyone knows who spends much time with me is that I'm different, which means the unknown, which means if that's your navigation skill where the unknown is threatening, which is the default safety thing, then I'm a threat. And so I kind of measure my dose. It creates a lot of loneliness, which is my biggest wound as a child, is dissociation and loneliness. It's very, very sad, very, very painful. It's incredibly frustrating. And this way of talking does not get me empathic points with 98% of the people. It results in a variety of dissociation, etc., which is frustrating as hell, because what I'm saying, as far as I can say with a lot of data analysis, is 100% correct, and it would be very valuable for this cult to deal with that reality and its implications. Because there is a 10x possibility in human relationships that this cult doesn't grasp, because it's not examining its default assumptions and paths at a variety of stages where relationships could be 10 times better with significantly less energy, but it's a hell of a lot of work to get to the point to be able to see that. But once you see it, it's very easy to do a lot better than almost all of our status quos in all areas, in education, in politics, in relationships, in science, in cultural paradigms, economy, any level like that. Once you develop that particular analytical skill where you understand intelligence is the efficiency of transforming energy, time, money, and natural resources into human well-being using a data-based model, you can get 10x improvement whilst conserving energy. And that's the most exciting thing in my world. And my biggest limitation is the fact that I don't like conflict, and I have to go into conflict with everyone. And Larry Page and Sergey Brin had a little bit of this with Google. And I don't know if they, they went through well over 100 rejections with everyone telling them they were full of shit before they got a few people to buy in. And if they'd given up because they were conflict averse, there would be no Google, the most valuable, contribution to human knowledge, etc. And so this is frustrating to grasp, to grasp that basically early childhood trauma is disabling at least 60% of my, potential on a daily basis, and that I'm not going to run into people that notice that and say, wow, this is a waste. Let's do something with this. People don't analyze that way. And so the waste is an invisible one, which is lonely, and painful as well. The last thing is that people in trauma tend to stay in familiar terrain. The more traumatized you are, the more you cling to the known. My wife, who can't swim very well, made the mistake of putting on her snorkeling goggles, we're in Thailand at the moment, over her glasses, which, as anyone knows, is ridiculous. So immediately she's flooded with water. So she goes into drowning panic mode immediately, and flails around and stuff. And she goes to this rock. And this rock is sharp with shells all over it, and it's cutting her up. But she's in trauma. She's afraid of dying. She had a 10-year-old drowning experience. All these things are coming up. She's not going to let go of the rock that's cutting her up. That's how trauma works. It works with homelessness. It works with abused children. It works with my wife, whose snorkel mask is filled with water. She's holding on for dear life to the rock that's cutting her up. And this is very important to understand. I understood it in my own biology because I started reading Bessel van der Kolk's book on trauma. So I understood that I was clinging to high because it was my rock. It was the primary source of love and belonging. I didn't have a backup anywhere in the world. And this is one of the key areas of abuse with sexual abuse of a therapeutic patient and things of that nature. I didn't have a backup. So I was clinging to my abusers who were continuing to abuse me every single day. They denied it was a high issue, that a high facilitator sexually abused a high participant. That position has done enormous damage to my sense of value. Not mentally, I understood they're idiots. To the felt sense that I was lovable as a being. They destroyed that day after day after day with pathological and sociopathic silence, refusing the apology that was the most decent thing that could have saved their organization from a tremendous amount of embarrassment. And this hurt me a lot. I didn't want to fight them, but I couldn't let go of my rock. So I got cut up, like my wife, like the homeless people who in Marin County cannot afford a $600,000 home, will never be able to afford a $600,000 home, and are hunted by the police, who have passed a law that they can't even sleep in their cars, are woken up at night with PTSD, shunted along like animals. We've got Nazi Germany in Marin County, and nobody gives a fuck. And we are spending $60,000 a year to maintain chronic homelessness when it would cost nothing to create a police-patrolled campground with $50 tents that gave them a safe, legal place to sleep with police protection rather than police harassment. Homeless people do not need dogs, private security company, and police chasing them with overwhelming numbers. These fucking cowards go in with like 3-4 police person for one homeless person. You fucking cowards. You're intimidating a regressed person. 42% of them have PTSD. And we don't want to look at the data. We don't want to look at the data. So I'm leveraging the fact and practicing also. I'm fighting with the mayor of San Rafael and the county because this is absurd. I do not want my tax money being spent to pathologically abuse citizens of the United States who have had nothing, who have done nothing wrong, but have an IQ that they were born with and that was emphasized often in childhood abuse that is below the level that can afford a tech job that can buy a $600,000 home. And there are no affordable homes, and it is against the law. So, and I digress, but at any point, people cling to what they're familiar with. And my body is very, very slowly letting go of the Human Awareness Institute as a good base. The problem with childhood abuse, by the way, is, of course, if I'd had a healthy childhood, I wouldn't have had any of these issues that needed to cling to high, one. And if high abused me, I could fall back on a healthy family. Abused people do not have a healthy family to fall back on. So the current abuser is often the person they cling to. And this is something I would see in the women who would cling to me. I would say, this is my 100%, I like this, this, and this. They'd say, okay. And I'd say, well, why are your eyes going like that and your body tightening up? Why are your thighs tightening as I'm making love to you, if this is okay? The body language is telling the truth. You're lying. I had to learn body language because my parents lied, and I had to protect against abuse. You're lying. Your body is not telling the narrative you're telling me. Now, the opposite is equally true. No, I don't want anything to do with you. I don't want a relationship. You're lying. Your body loves being around me. What's the deal here? But the response to having a traumatic lie revealed is life-threatening panic. And I didn't have the sensitivity or the paradigm. I knew they were lying, but I didn't know why. I didn't know the abuse contract that was beneath the lie. I didn't know the trauma, and I didn't know how to repair it. I didn't know how to tell them what was going on because I was traumatically illiterate, having been sustained in a state of sociopathic ignorance about this in childhood and school and by therapists and in all of my Human Awareness Institute workshops. So this is a big crisis because Peter Sandhill started shaming this dynamic right off the bat when I started saying this is not resolved. And he would go and consult with healers, according to him, who didn't meet me, who of course had no clue what was going on. Why would they? The best way to have no clue about what's going on is to diagnose a patient who you haven't even met and you refuse to talk to. Well, he would tell me their diagnosis and say that I should be moving on and stuff like that as a profoundly cruel ignorance and abuse of this situation. So, that is High's playbook. I don't take it personally, but it is life-threatening. So that's kind of the last thing is, for the abused child and me, the only way to be safe and restore love and belonging is to get these abusers to stop abusing me and learn how to love me so I don't have to fight them and so that I don't lose my 5-year-old sense of love and belonging. And this is the biggest betrayal of Ann Watts, when her first advice to me was to shut up and keep this silent and protect my abuser, because she built up credit with the wounded child in the one-on-one work, and she exploited that leverage to protect the person she, as the teacher, trainer, and the one who had recommended him to me, was ethically bound to deposition until he was safe for the public. She exposed her own, by violating the therapeutic ethic of putting your client first, which is a sacred ethic. It's not for nothing there's a Hippocratic oath. And mental emotional health is often much more important than physical health. I would happily have a finger chopped off with a machete and risk bleeding to death and take my chances rather than go through the hell psychologically that these facilitators have put me through and are poised to put the next person through, because at this level of pathological and willful ignorance, fighting each step of the way, defending each step of the way, there is no logical analysis that says that it's going to be better for the next person. Or if it is, it's not going to be better enough. It's not enough to mitigate sexual abuse by a professional. You've got to stop it from happening. So that's why all the videos. Longer answer than I thought, but that is the answer. Why this medium? Why video? Why not just talk with a facilitator? A couple things. One, they wore me down. I was getting exhausted because this was never their highest priority to put the life of their client first. Their highest priority was to conserve energy, conserve money, and protect the secret. Every one of their actions lines up with that pattern. So they wore me down. And Peter lied, even after having a 10-hour recording of some of this going on. Peter lied. And so my biggest terror as I faced the enormity of my own ignorance and all that I had to learn and say to come clear around this, and the deep awareness that I was going to be misunderstood right and left by people who didn't know enough to know that they needed to ask questions, or it was inevitable they would misunderstand the terrain. And so I said, I just don't have the energy to go through hundreds of hours of conversation with people fighting me again and again and again. I've got to say this one time. It's like, and so how do you do that? Well, film is particularly when there's more integrity in the body and in tonal voice and stuff for those that can notice that than there is in writing. And also it was difficult. It was just exhausting. They left me in a very exhausted state because I'd have to fight. I'd have to repeat myself 2 or 3 times just to Peter Sandhill. You said you would do this, now you're still doing that. You just said it was all about me, and now you've asked me to do things better for you. I mean, every single interaction was this kind of double thing that raises red flags and elevates trauma. So scale. How do you bring information to an entire community when you're one person and you've got 10, 20 people wanting to put a lid on it, minimize it, discount it, and all that? Well, you've got to take control of the medium and have a replicatable form of communication, or it's exhausting. This is how a lot of people are worn down. The other is state dependency. The conflict aversion meant, and the contract meant that I've been in relationships with therapists where I've pushed them a little and they've gotten defensive and I've just left it. I don't want to be in a vulnerable therapeutic relationship with someone who has a defensive agenda and is threatened by me. So I just drop it. And so to be able to speak myself, exactly what I'm seeing and feeling myself, I can't have the body language, tonally, action-wise, facial stuff in my face telling me how terrified they are or how angry they are. I understand the facilitator personalities enough to know a fair amount of their probability field. I understand their grief. I understand their remorse. I understand their silence. I understand their anger. I understand Peter in particular is very angry. His teenager is very, very angry at being told what to do and stuff like this. I don't need that distraction. This way, it's directly into a camera. I'm aware of it in the background, but it's not in my face. That's another thing. I couldn't maintain this state under the influence of awareness of how it's upsetting other people. Next question: what do you see as the outcome? Well, there's a range of possible outcomes, some with high being restructured, some with high falling apart, and certain ethical people within the high community rebuilding it from scratch in a much stronger way. Those are all good things. There's also, having understood that I'm not the only person who's been abused, I have mixed feelings about whether or not, given the harm that is caused by all these blind spots, whether or not the world might be a better place if high in its current form didn't exist at all, given the amount of traumatic abuse in the community. And so that is a possible outcome. The most important outcome of all, and this is unfortunate, in a numb, somewhat sociopathic framework where we're afraid to question leaders, where people are in a childlike state in relationship to the facilitators as projected parents, which is always the case when you have undissolved abuse contracts. that the community may not be willing to listen to any of this unless a court with expert advisors, which are very easy to get, say, this is wrong, this must be shut down. It may take that for someone in an abuse dynamic with a projected parent to actually get that they need to learn more and shift. Because if the abuser loses the authority position, and this has been studied in childhood abuse as well, where it's essential in many cases for the child to see their parent put in jail, because that's what tells them the parent is not the authority. Now the judge is the authority, but the judge isn't abusing them. The judge is telling them they're good and they did nothing wrong. And so this is sometimes a very important thing for breaking an abuse contract. It's not ideal. None of this is ideal. We are an emotionally, psychologically illiterate cult in which there is no ideal outcome in this situation. But there's ranges, and the most important range or possibility thing that I believe is important is people need to know how much they don't know. And they need to know where they can find information about what they don't know, so that they can start knowing and start incorporating that data, and that their relationships can be more competent and less abusive as a result of that knowledge. So that's the number one outcome that I'm committed to in a whole variety of ways, not just with HIGH, but once this is out in some form that gets across, which is an ongoing project, I will be sending this, worldwide to schools, to therapists, to anyone who will listen, and also talking about the blind spot, the pushback, so that individuals can understand the groups and things they can and cannot trust. Because no competent, confident group of professionals will reject this information. They may refine it, they may add to it, they may give it a niche, fine. But you do not reject data in a competent paradigm. And there is a lot of substantive data here that I have not heard from a single competent source. And it is unethical and unconscionable that professionals are not leading with this data rather than, masking it or showing little interest in it. Do you think the crime is worth the possible consequences? Yes, and I'm measuring that because my choice, because I believe there is a 30% healthy constituency within the personas of the facilitator body, not the board. I don't think the board was chosen with any competence, whatever, but the facilitators actually do know a fair amount of what I'm talking about. And 30% or more of the facilitators, their personas, their perceptions resonate to what I'm saying, because they got into HIGH for good reasons. They wanted to help. And their behavior in these areas are destroying their mission. And they're not happy about that. They're conflicted and divided. The best possible scenario is that the wake-up call of a court case, national media publicity, if necessary, is enough to get the 30% of them that is already on board with doing the right thing to overcome the traumatic fear of the unknown by helping, basically I'm positioning the reality so that their fear, rather than shutting down and creating an abuse dynamic, would be working for them. That their fear about survival, facing the unknown, humiliation and all that, would actually work for them doing the right thing rather than against them. Because you can't change the fact that someone has a certain percentage of fear-based personas. So if you want someone to do the right thing, and they're in a denial, fear-based kind of protocol, you've got to switch the dynamic where their fear is higher of doing the wrong thing than of the right thing. Then that fear colludes with the part of them that already wants to do the right thing, and now you're on the same page. I don't like playing the good cop, bad cop dynamic in that. It is a very sad analysis for an abused child who's desperate for love and belonging to understand that their gatekeepers in that domain are fear-based in the majority vote to an extent that they are suppressing information that they need to grow and learn. And to understand that to get the vote, many politicians, for example, will take a bribe, and as long as it's under the thing, it's not that they're trying to hurt the economy, they want the bribe. And they, well, it happens all the time. They have their excuses and stuff. But if the bribe is exposed, unless they give the money back and do the right thing, they'll often, now they're afraid of, losing their job and all that. And now they'll do the right thing out of a mixture of fear and positive thing. Now this is, as I say, it's a very, very lonely world to understand these dynamics and codes and stuff, particularly when everyone is in denial of them. I'm dealing with a minister who's doing this thing in the Unity of Marin Church around homelessness. He's in complete denial of the fact that he's primarily egotistically based rather than doing the right thing in his ministry. So I've said, all of your emails and this whole pattern of denial and obfuscation and stuff will be published and made available to all of your board of directors and members unless you do the right thing. Well, suddenly he's interested in doing the right thing. He wants to make it very clear he's doing the right thing because he wants to do the right thing, and that is correct. 20% of him is a great minister. Another bit is just confused and distracted and stuff, and he's got a good politically minded maneuvering thing that he's primarily interested in his own social ranking and stuff, and homelessness is not going to help him in his politically oriented mind. But it will if the alternative is to be exposed as a fraud, which he is in this domain, to the degree that he prioritizes his own personal agendas and importance and all this over actually doing something that's within the charter of his church. So, this, and this is also why this is such a big deal for me, is, breaking this abuse contract is shifting interactions throughout my life and opening up the doorway for conflict-based healthy interactions, which have currently been buried behind a wall of life-threatening biological terror that makes that an impossibility. I'm still sorting it out because it is both lonely, sad, frustrating to be put in these different manipulative type dynamics where abuses of power are going on, and you understand that the only way to pivot, whether it's the mayor of San Rafael or whatever, is actually to position the fear of the abuser, who is incompetent in a domain, to allying with doing the right thing. It's not love. It's lonely. It's sociopathic. It's a tragedy. I mean, I have wept over this situation because the difference between the Human Awareness Institute facilitators responding to this situation because they had traumatized a client who was in desperate need of their love and support, and doing this for political reasons out of fear, etc., is enormous for them. It would have been an incredible accomplishment spiritually, ethically, and for the organization to do the right thing that they know because it's the right thing. They just didn't have the internal votes. That's how loud trauma is. They're afraid for their survival. It's just inappropriate for fear to govern a public nonprofit in such a sensitive domain that can affect whether someone lives or dies in their professional care. And so that has to be stood for. That has to be stood for everyone's sake. Everyone benefits from that. And we all know that. But can we face the uncertainty of the unknown, the fear, the trauma? Can we face that to act consistently with that truth? Or do we avoid the fear of the unknown and protect our trauma? This is a very, very, very big pivot point. And it's one of the reasons that I wanted to go into so much code and depth and break things down on so many levels. I believe, by the way, that if someone takes a year of their time to sample anywhere from 100 to 1,000 hours of this terrain in kind of strategically sampled ways, that as I've experienced with my own marriage and my own life, etc., that there is well, I don't actually know this information because I don't know whose mind works the way mine works. And Anne pointed out that I make mistakes in expecting people to be competent in areas that are very easy for me, but which another person simply cannot do and is not going to be able to do. And I make a mistake in that arena. I accept Anne's thing with some unknown because so many people mask the dialogue in this domain. I can't get a sense of exactly what that is. But at least I can show humility that I do not know about that. But it is my assumption, I should say, that a therapist in particular or a professional going through this material could get more than they've gotten with their therapeutic degree from understanding and putting together what I've said and extrapolating it. Because I haven't met the therapist who has been competent to help me see what I've seen with extrapolation, self-awareness, physiological examination, and reading 1,000 hours of literature. I haven't found anyone who's covered even 5% of the terrain that I'm talking about. That's not true. Bessel van der Kolk, covers a lot of it, and the body keeps a score. But putting it together in this way, I'm very interested to see how many people can be benefited, and so I'm going to see that they get the chance. If nobody's mind works the way mine does, so they're not benefited, then I've got to reinterpret the data and put it out in another format, or leave it to professionals to do that, because there isn't a language issue. But my hope is that that this can help others the way it's been helping me. So do you think the crime is worth the possible consequences? Yes, I do. I was thinking the other day that, if in a state of willful blindness, some of the facilitators end up in prison, which is a possibility if I bring in the district attorney of Marin, because that I lose control. I don't think prison is ideal, but there's much worse situations than having free room and board and the chance to read the 100 books that I'd recommend that could create a dramatically better professional on the other side with a lot more humility, which is what is needed. And I will see that anyone gets the books that wants them if they do end up in a cell, because prison is a disaster if you don't focus on education and rehabilitation. It's not the ideal. It is just the way the laws are written. And I don't necessarily have the stamina to see that High does the right thing or is shut down alone. And I've been referred to the district attorney of Marin, but I'm going to hold off and give the facilitators the choice of dealing with this head on as professional adults, resigning from the situation and doing their best, etc., or the courts are the only authority in a position to do something about this. And it is profoundly abusive to ask an individual to be stuck in the middle of all this with the ignorance and abuses of 4 therapists, etc. And this is absolute atrocious behavior. it's not the model. I'm trying to create a model based on the data that would help the average abused person in this situation come out ahead. That has to be the goal, or the whole thing has failed. That's the number one goal. Everyone's loyalty must be with the client, the therapeutic patient, the abuse survivor as the primary priority, or nothing will work here. And, you know, I cannot force the facilitators to give an apology if they don't want, do this, or that, the other, follow the law. I can only hand it over to authorities if they are unwilling to grapple with the data. Do you want a role in this? Yes, I want this role. I want the role of gathering data, of sharing the data that I know. I am a terrible person in a political group situation, compromising and stuff, because I follow the data thread as best I can see it. And I don't see compromise as being in anyone's interest. I don't have an agenda other than that the practices be in place that benefit the most people over time, period. And if the data says this should be done, I don't see anyone winning and compromising with some idea like, well, what about their opinion? Are they the most competent person in the room? Do they have the data? Can they back it up? In which case I will change my opinion. But I am not going to change 1,000 hours of data and analysis with a good pattern analyzing brain because someone has an opinion they can't articulate. That's just absurd. I've been asked by the facilitators constantly to do the wrong thing, and every single time that I've accommodated them out of fear, my life has suffered, and so has the Human Awareness Institute and its mission. So but that is the tendency in a dynamic like this, is to be, well, why can't we meet in the middle? Because it's not in your interest to do so. Because your organization will suffer. Your finances will suffer if you don't have better results than you're getting. Your reputation will suffer because it's not in your interest. Because it's not in the patient's or the client's or the participant's interest. It's that simple. They all line up around what's good for the client. So the horror of this whole thing has been noticing the amount of energy that the facilitators have spent to make things worse or avoid making things better in vastly easier ways. The apology was my analysis of the most impactful positive thing they could do to my psyche that would be free, that they could do in an afternoon, and it would allow us to move on and would suggest that they grasped what was going on and could take responsibility for the safety of their clients. When they refused to apologize, they committed an unimaginable crime to themselves, their mission, and the data set that is killing their future as well as any abuse survivor in their midst, which I have every reason to believe there will be more of until this is dealt with. How will they feel, if you believe in an afterlife, when after all this good intention and bullshit about mission without gathering data and stuff, when they get to analyze their lives and they discover that they took a lower salary and worked their asses off to keep an organization afloat so that they could abuse people and mask the abuse and caused enormous harm? On that metric alone, which no one has to believe in, it's just one of many, many slices that all point to the same thing. The organization and everyone in it benefits when the best practices available for relationship are embodied by the facilitators, and when it, as an act of self-love, organizational love, love for the client, law, good business practices, that is strictly adhered to and modeled, everyone wins.